Hey y'all. In this video, I'm going to talk about a book I just finished reading today called Isles of Emberdark by Brandon Sanderson. I wanted to start off by saying I liked this book a lot more than I thought I would after I was about halfway through, maybe 60%. I found it pretty much impossible to put down, just like a lot of Sanderson's books. The inevitable Sanderlanche. And I forgive a lot of the pet peeves I might talk about later in the video, just because the book had such amazing character moments, growth. Some of the world building was really cool, and dialogue, character moments are just so exceptional that I could get over a lot of the pet peeves I have about this book. But it's not a perfect, amazing book like I feel about earlier Mistborn books. How I feel about Warbreaker, how I feel a bit about Tress. Like a lot of his books, I think are incredibly perfect in just about every way. And I don't know. I haven't been feeling that way about his recent stuff. So I want to start off with a good. The themes in this book are incredible. There's a quote I thought encapsulated it really well. This comes from Vathi, where she's talking about the ones above and says, "Oh, Dusk, they are planning to do to us what we are doing to Pachi, aren't they?" So the idea about like the cycle of colonization and how there's always like a bigger entity out there trying to take advantage of you, I think is really well captured in this book, especially on a spatial level. It has a lot of themes about kind of what's happened in our world with globalization that I don't think a lot of people necessarily think about anymore, especially from if you're in a wealthier country and you can't really see how the stuff you get is made. And this book captures that really well, and that should be the goal of fantasy, right? To capture complex ideas that are hard to understand or maybe tangled up in so many outside political meanings in the actual world, and you could kind of showcase them in a fantasy setting that could be more open and accepting for people to kind of look at from an unbiased perspective. Um, the character dynamics in this book were good in some regards. The stuff with Dusk and Starling and Dusk with anybody was amazing. Dusk is great. Between Starling and her crew, I saw someone say that they felt a lot like the friend group that Painter has in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, and I'd have to agree because I forgot that friend group existed until that comment. Um, excuse me. I just thought it just felt like random stand-ins. They were not different than each other in any way that felt significant. So yeah, just people, and I thought it kind of bogged down parts of the book, and I think like especially at the beginning of part two, it was like, all right, this is a slow read. I'm not zooming through it like I do a lot of Sanderson books that are impossible to put down. And I didn't think I'd like the book that much. I thought it would be my least favorite, and it was great after that. But you really had to get through that, and I think that's a real shame. But overall, the plot was really good once you got past that. It reminds me a lot of like Elantris, just in feeling wise and how fast it went by the end. It was great. And as I said, the themes of this book are some of Sanderson's best. I love the stuff he's talking about. So, very impressed. Some of my negatives are the prose. I don't really have a problem with Sanderson's kind of invisible, see through glass prose. I think that's how he usually describes it. But there's just words that he used. His whole using modern words, I just don't like. I just think it takes away from it. Here's a list I have. He used the word rock star. A launchpad was used in the prologue with dragons. I just feel like launchpad is a helicopter thing. I'm very skeptical that dragons would have that word. But whatever. Uh, Fascist was too much for me when they straight up used the word fascist. You're describing the Malwish Empire as fascist very well descriptively. You don't need to tell me they're fascist. That was a bit much. Uh, Bigoted opportunist. I don't know. Like the word bigoted when Daher was described as through what he did is very bigoted. You just didn't need to call him bigoted. I feel like it takes away. There was the word emoted, wizard, that sucks as a phrase. That sucks. And then Dusk recognizes that the word that Starling uses is sucks, as in the exact meaning of sucks, not like a translated phrase, which means they somehow have the exact same slang as us. Uh, You'd so fragrantly violate the Silverlight Accords felt very on the nose. There's just moments like that. So, yeah, I'm not a fan of it. He did a lot in Wind and Truth, and I think it was worse in Wind and Truth because how are they getting all these words? But at least in the space age, you could maybe say they modernized so quickly that they developed a lot of this lingo. I just don't like it though. It feels very earthy to me, but whatever. Uh, Another issue I had with the book is the pacing. They introduced aforementioned crew of starlings. They introduced like 7 characters, like a quarter through the book out of nowhere. And if I would have been, first of all, that would never get published if it wasn't an already established author. That's an insane thing to do. Even in The Way of Kings, where he introduces about a quarter of the way, Dalinar and Adolin and Sadios and Elhokar and all those people, that's crazy. And the only reason he could get published, I really think this, is because he was established. And that book is great. But this was a bit much. 7 characters randomly is crazy. And if you're going to Barnes and Noble and you're just going to like, new releases by highly popular authors, and you say, oh, this is a cool cover, and you pick it up and try to read the Sanderson book. Unlike actually any of his standalones except Sunlit Man, which would also be confusing, but not like this one. This would be so confusing. Like the character and the crew from the Grand Apparatus, who comes from a planet we haven't read from, I just accepted I wouldn't understand anything going on. If you picked up this book randomly, you would have to accept that for a lot of the plot. And that's not good for fantasy. By Sanderson's own rules that he talks about in his lectures, the reader's only going to be as satisfied as they understand the magic system, and this made no sense. I'm sorry. Like, I'm sure there's rules for stuff, but we don't understand anything happening anymore. The way dragons work, the way investiture works, all this stuff, you'd have to have read everything and be heavily interacted in the fan base, and that's just not realistic. Like, I haven't read a Sanderson book since Wind and Truth, and that's just going to be true. I'm going to read them like once every 8 months, and that's, if he's publishing at insane speed. And you forget stuff. I don't like having to look stuff up the whole time while I'm reading. And I feel bad for people who are just picking this up. And I'm worried he's going to turn into a Marvel situation where the only way to understand anything in the future is to have read literally everything. And I don't like that. I liked that in the earlier books. If you hadn't read everything, it didn't matter. And I mean, you just can't do that anymore. Even Mistborn, you could have read into Era 2 without reading anything else, and you would have been like chilling. But The Lost Metal makes no sense if you haven't read Stormlight. I mean, or it makes some sense, but it's random. The Ghostbloods are super random there. And then probably my biggest concern is the direction the Cosmere is going. Clearly, it's going in a sci-fi direction, and the basic premise of the series is, it seems to me, it's going to be the first sci-fi fantasy series in the sense that it's sci-fi stemming from a fantasy world, not our own planet, which is compelling and super interesting. But the problem is that the only people who are going to be able to enjoy these books is a very special and rare group of people, and it's self-selective, and it could cause, I don't know, it to get a lot less popular. I'm going to use an example here that seems totally random, but the National Football League had a competitor in like the early 2000s called the XFL, the Extreme Football League or whatever it was called. And the idea was to mix pro wrestling and football, thinking that the people who would watch it would be people who liked pro wrestling and people who liked football. So you'd have a much bigger audience than just people who watched pro football. Problem was, the only people who watched were people who liked both pro wrestling and football, which was a very small sliver of the Venn diagram. It's not actually that large of a population. And the league failed, right? Because you're actually selecting who's going to read it. So that's the problem with these books. People who just like sci-fi aren't going to read Sanderson's sci-fi books that take place in the Cosmere if they have to have understood all the fantasy first. People who just like fantasy are going to stop. They're going to, like, that's kind of where I'm at, where I don't hate sci-fi, but I liked the fantasy more. And I don't know. I don't want to only read sci-fi if that's what the Cosmere is going to become, to be honest. And then there's the third group, which is people who like sci-fi and fantasy who are going to love it, which is great for them. But the only people in that group who are going to be able to read these books are people who, again, have read everything before. So there's a barrier of entry and a barrier of interest. And it's cool that he's doing it, but I'm worried. And I don't know. I'm nostalgic for when new releases would just have Easter eggs and not make you totally reliant on having read everything. But those are my thoughts. I really enjoyed the book, despite how pessimistic I'm sounding. But I don't know. I'm wary and skeptical, I guess. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below.